Hi, everyone. Welcome to our ongoing series of webinars inside the investigation. I'm Ellen Weiss. I'm a very proud board member of FIJ, and I'm excited to bring you these series of conversations, the opportunity to shine a light on some amazing, impactful investigative work and actually hear from the reporters about how they did these groundbreaking investigations. You're going to get some concrete tips and resources so that all of you and your newsrooms can use to do these kinds of investigations. We like to talk about investigations that are done with the fund's support, and you'll also hear about how you can apply for grants up to $10,000 to support investigative work that you might be working on and need help for. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to talk with our guests for 20 to 30 minutes. If you have questions, please add them whenever they occur to you in the Q&A section. Also, we are recording this webinar and we will post it along with the tip sheet on the FIJ website. So you don't have to take notes if you just want to listen in. Also, if you registered, you will get a link to the recording and a link to the website in a couple of days. So we'll get started. Often when we hear the term eviction, the first thing that comes to mind is gentrification. We think about landlords wanting to sell property, or tear down low-cost rental property in order to build something more expensive. But this is a story about tenants who are evicted because of a landlord who just doesn't care. This is a story, an investigation that was done by Injustice Watch that dug into the unfair treatment of thousands of Chicago renters living in unsafe and decaying apartments, all the time facing skyrocketing rents and a court system designed to protect the rights of the landlords first. By the way, the project just won an IRE award, so congratulations. Our guests today, senior reporters Alejandra Cancino and Maya Dukmasova, interviewed more than 100 tenants, landlords, judges, attorneys, and other experts, and conducted an unprecedented analysis of more than 2 million records from the Chicago Department of Buildings and the Cook County Circuit Court. And through the data, they identified thousands of apartment buildings in Chicago with a history of unsafe and serious code violations, most of them in majority Black communities. Despite repeated citations and legal actions, many of these landlords continue to profit while the tenants face unsafe conditions and housing instability. And what they've done is really exposed a deep systemic failure in the city's housing and court system. So really an amazing investigation. Alejandra is a senior reporter at Injustice Watch. That's the Chicago-based nonprofit newsroom investigating the Cook County court system. Her award-winning work focuses on the intersection of government and business and combines data and personal stories to expose systemic failures. She's a member of the IRE board and a former president and board member of the Chicago Headline Club, the local chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. Maya is also a senior reporter at Injustice Watch. Prior to that, she was a staff writer at the Chicago Reader and a freelance writer, translator, and photographer. Her work has heavily focused on housing, wrongful convictions, and judicial accountability. Maya has also won numerous local and national journalism awards and is also a past board member of the Chicago Headline Club. So Maya and Alejandra, thank you so much for being with us. Let me just start by asking, what was the original spark or tip that led you both to this investigation?
Well, I had just started at Injustice Watch, and we all came together at sort of like it was really great to see all of us coming together at the same time. Maya had been at Injustice Watch for I believe 5 years by that point. Maya, three to 5 years.
Two, but yeah.
2 years. Okay, totally off there. But she had compiled over the course of her reporting a database of eviction records. And so essentially when landlords take renters to court, to eviction court, it's an eviction filing, it's a lawsuit. And even though those are public records, you would have to look at them one at a time. And Maya had done this tremendous work in getting bulk level data that we could analyze. And she had written tons of stories about it for her previous employer. And I had written a previous investigation into public housing residents in Chicago, and I had talked to Maya about this database, and I knew that she had it. And because I had written about public housing records, I sort of was this idea in my mind of what is the conditions of renters in like low income housing kind of was in my mind. And our editor had just finished investigating or finished editing a project that went on to win the Pulitzer Prize on the conditions of apartments in Chicago. And so we all kind of came, my editor and our editor and I kind of joined around the same time, and we were thinking about sort of like story ideas, and we decided to give it a go and try to see what happens when we use this tremendous amount of information that Maya had collected and kind of match it to a public database of building conditions in the city to sort of answer that initial question: what is the conditions of apartment buildings for low-income people?
Great. I'm going to share my screen for a second because I want to show just a slide of like what you found. And let's see if I can bring it up. Yeah, so as I mentioned in the intro, you guys found thousands of apartments, and you connected this massive pool. You found thousands of apartments that were run down. This was a really heavy lift in terms of the data. Oh, sorry, we're looking at the wrong slide. Let me just go back. There we go. Yeah. So this is 2,654 buildings that were cited for serious building code violations. I mean, to get to this slide, to get to this point, to get to that number, you worked with some outside partners. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that process, like how you got, to this point.
Yeah, so right away when we first started looking at our different buckets of data, we had the eviction data, the case level data on every eviction filed in Cook County going back to 2007, which had addresses for the places from which people were being evicted. So we had the city building department data that speaks to the conditions at buildings, which is also includes addresses of where inspectors are citing these building code violations. But there was the way that these addresses were entered into these totally disconnected databases wasn't standardized at all. So we knew right away that in order to figure out, what's happening at the intersection of building of bad building conditions and evictions, we were going to need to build like one massive database that would link these records, and that required a huge amount of data cleaning and standardization that was just beyond what Alejandra and I's data journalism capacity. So we partnered with Alex Richards at Syracuse University, who did a lot of early coding work to get these databases to be able to be relational by standardizing the addresses and cleaning them. There was, in the eviction data, there were a lot of issues with incorrect zip codes being assigned to addresses, so that had to be fixed using a program called Geocodio. And once Alex helped us build the standardized database, then we turned to our partners at Datamade, and Forrest Gregg, our data guru there, helped us essentially figure out a way to design like a little equation, like a little algorithm that would capture which buildings actually have chronic serious violations. We had an idea of which code violations the city considered serious from an internal document that we got from a few years ago. And so we filtered all of these violations by, like, first, let's just look at the serious ones. And then we started looking at patterns over time to see what kind of buildings would qualify for, like, essentially being habitual offenders. And finally, we landed on the criteria being that they have citations for serious code violations in at least 4 distinct calendar years. And then the most recent one came in the last 3 years. And once we narrowed it like that, that's how we came up with these 2,654 buildings.
Wow. Talk a little bit about the partnership, because I think what's interesting to me is you didn't necessarily partner with another newsroom in order to do this. You found partners both in academia and elsewhere. And I think sometimes, especially in a small newsroom, you have to be creative about thinking like, well, where can we get our help from? And I just wonder, how that worked for you.
Yeah, we both of us knew that we had the reporting skills that it took to be able to do, the underground reporting. But when it came to data, I mean, that was really our Achilles heel. And we had, like you mentioned, millions of rows of data that we needed to analyze. And so that was beyond our capacity. And so when we were talking to our editor about what we needed, so we needed 2 things. We needed someone who could help us clean the data, right? Like that is a significant job to the way in which we got the data initially, which Maya got the data initially, was not it was like the entire docket. So it wasn't just like a clean one line. You had all the lines that would be on the docket, and so they had to like essentially Alex cleaned it to make sure that there was just one line with all the information that we needed that we could then use to like match the database, and then clean the addresses to be able to match them by addresses. So I mean, Alex is a professor at Syracuse University now, but this industry is about who you know, right? Alex used to work at the Chicago Tribune, where I used to work and where my editor used to work, so we sort of knew him. And he had limited time, right? So because he was a full-time professor, so he could help us, and he got us, like more than half the way there with being able to like clean the data. And then our next problem was like, well, now we need to analyze it, right? Like we need to ask tons of questions of this data, and it's so massive, and our questions were fairly complicated, right? We needed to come up with an equation that would allow us to, what we were seeing essentially in the data were these patterns of buildings having serious building code violations in some years, and then being off, and then coming back and having serious code violations again. And so like never escaping this kind of cycle of being in and out of having serious code violations, but it wasn't uniform. It wasn't like every building had it every 2 years and then they would be off and then they will be back. And so we needed to come up with an equation that kind of like allowed us to have some conclusions about what the pattern was. And that requires significant, someone who had a lot of skills in analyzing data. And so we were really lucky that Injustice Watch had partnered before with DataMate, and we had this, partnership already on the books, and we were able just to tap and lean on Forrest to help us. We literally were meeting once a week for an hour, and we would just run equations through the data, and we run through the limitations of the data. I mean, Maya and I did significant amount of work, and like, okay, after, we had all of this information, we needed to triple check to make sure that like things were accurate. What we were saying were accurate. So we will pull, say 100 records, and we will go through the actual court system to pull the actual files to make sure that the analysis that we were doing corresponded with the actual physical documents and what the case file actually said. So yeah, sorry, I ramble a little. I think I answered your question.
I think so, yeah. I mean, I think what's really important, and this came up in our last webinar, is, there can be people in your local community, there are people in the environment that, are interested in helping. And I think especially if you don't have a super big data team, or, even sometimes the server power, whatever, that academia is a really interesting place to go. There may be other people in your community. And I just want to say that because this project in particular ended up being like a data monster. which was great because you were also able to, get real numbers and do something that no one had ever done before.
Yeah, and I would just add to that as other people consider because the idea of like, why didn't we partner with another news organization? I think one of the things we learned through these partnerships is that it's actually it can be a lot more fruitful to work with someone who's not a journalist, but who is like a programmer, is very well versed in coding languages, and can think about numbers and data in sophisticated ways. Because we can do the reporting portion, we can find people, we can do the interviews, we can kind of understand, get all the context for what the numbers mean. But I feel like we're coming off of a kind of 20-year trend in this business of everyone kind of saying like, we need to learn how to code, we need to be able to do data journalism ourselves and learn programming languages and all this stuff. I mean, it would take years, and maybe we would never get to be as good at R as our partner at DataMade. Like, there's no there's no amount of data journalism training that Alejandra and I could do that would get us to the level that this professional programmer is able to be at just on a daily basis. So it was a very, very productive collaboration because we were able to go a lot further, and this person just needed to know how to think about numbers and patterns. And we had the reporting, the journalism handled.
Yeah, no, that's really great to hear. Well, let's focus a little bit on that human story. I wonder if you could tell us maybe the story of one of the tenants that you met who kind of was living through this nightmare of, living in a building that was so substandard with a landlord who didn't care, trying to exercise their rights and just, hitting a system that didn't see them as they saw landlords.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you about Megan Franklin, who we followed for a whole year. And she was such an interesting person to meet. She had a master's degree. She lived in this south side of the city in a neighborhood called Woodland. And she settled in that specific neighborhood because she wanted her kids to be in a, in it, the Black community was important to her, but also like it had really good schools. And that was really key to her being there. And she had lived in this apartment for a while. When she initially moved in, it was essentially a condo building where the owner of the condo was renting out an apartment, and it was, a small landlord. It was one person who owned the apartment it was a doctor who ended up moving to New York and had plans of someday coming back to Chicago to that apartment. And, in the meantime, he was just renting the apartment to Megan. So Megan lives there for a while, and then she starts noticing that there are changes happening, and there are people knocking on her door asking her if she wants to sell the condo, and she's like, well, what do you mean? And she went to her master's degree. She studied about gentrification, and she knew what this meant. And she starts getting nervous about what it meant, because it usually means that people like her, like longtime residents who live in these apartments, will be either the rent will increase and she will no longer afford to be there, but in one way or another, she would end up having to leave. And displacement is something that she thought a lot about, because being from a Black community in Chicago, her family had been displaced before, and she wanted to fight against it as best she could. So being a rented, the only thing that she could do is close the door and not give her the name and number of the owner of the apartment. But eventually, because of a local law that says that once, essentially the owners were pressured to sell, and they sold to these local investors, two brothers. And the way she tells the story and the way the records show it is like, once the two brothers took over, the conditions in the apartments sort of started deteriorating, and they deteriorated quickly. By the time she formed a tenant union and had other residents kind of come in and talk about what was going on, they had significant issues with rats. And she had tried multiple times to get the landlords to address this issue, but the issue wasn't being addressed. It's eventually they call the system through which inspectors are sent to homes, which is what we call locally a 311 system. They make a phone call, you complain about the conditions of the apartment, then the city forwards that to the buildings department. The buildings department then, gets it in front of an inspector who decides whether or not the problem is big enough for them to show up. And they did show up, and they find a lot of the issues that the tenants had been complaining about. There were issues with holes where possibly where the rats were coming in. There was issues, so like the infestation, water issues in like departments that were below the grade. So then as times goes on, she and the neighbors decide that they want to withhold their rent. One of the laws in Chicago called the landlord tenant ordinance says that if the landlord doesn't make the repairs that you're demanding, that the tenant has the right to withhold a portion of the rent. So not all of your rent, but a portion of it. But it is very technical. There's a number of steps that you have to take before you even do that. But they collectively decide to withhold. And, this is something that we hear often, that tenants get so angry that the only thing that they think about is like, that's it, I'm not paying. And oftentimes they don't think about the multiple steps that they have to take before withholding the rent. But, they consult with an attorney, they make the decision to withhold the rent. And as they were withholding, they also learned from the city that the city was going to take the landlord to housing court, which is where the city takes the landlords that have not made efforts to repair the serious code violations in hopes that the court system will force the landlord to make these repairs. And at the same time, we also hear that the tenants are being taken to eviction court because they're withholding the rent. They have been withholding the rent. So initially, when we talked to this renter, Megan, she says like, these evictions are not going to fly. There's the judge is going to see that there is another case that the city is taking. It's not me, right? It's the city taking my landlord to court because of the issues. I'm pretty sure the case is going to be dismissed. And what happens next is essentially we hear about, we see it, we observe what happens in these dual court systems, right? How the landlords are treated in housing court versus how the tenants are treated in eviction court. And it's a sad story. I mean, most of the stories that we wrote about end with the tenants essentially leaving either through a settlement or because they are formally evicted.
Yeah, this is where your story went like next level for me. And I was like, oh my God, because you found that there are 328 buildings where the landlords had filed evictions in the same year that the city was taking them to court over building code violations. So in one courtroom, the landlords are being taken to court by the city for violations. And, and then 2 floors up, the residents are being taken to eviction court for withholding rent because the landlords refuse to repair the building. And as you said, it doesn't go well for the tenants. And I wonder, first of all, you connecting the two was like so interesting. But can you talk a little bit about this and about what you literally, sort of observed and what, like you being in court and even like what you gleaned from how the system ends up favoring the landlords, even those who are in court because of housing violations?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, what we discovered is that if you think about the landlord-tenant relationship as a contractual one, where whether there's a formal written lease or not, there's an agreement that's being entered into that I, the landlord, am providing you an apartment to live in exchange for rent. And you have to pay me rent and you have to abide by certain rules. And in exchange, I'm giving you a place to live. And the place to live, I mean, there's some bare minimum standards that are expected to be met. So, the place has to have a roof. In Illinois, there's been something called the implied warranty of habitability going back to the 1970s, which means that regardless of what the lease says, what it says on paper, regardless of what's formally articulated, there's a minimum standard of habitability that is implied by the landlord-tenant relationship. By the fact of renting out an apartment, you are guaranteeing a certain minimum standard. And so what we found is essentially when we started looking at like what happens when the tenant doesn't meet their obligations in this contractual relationship versus what happens when landlords don't meet their contractual obligations, we found a completely separate and an unequal justice system for the property owners and the property occupants. And essentially what we discovered in the area of the court system where landlords are taken to sued by the city of Chicago over code violations is a kind of, I mean, to me, it just seemed like a kind of restorative justice process. It's the kind of thing that people sort of dream of in the criminal legal space, because the landlord is brought to court because some stuff is wrong. They have failed to maintain their property. They failed to abide by the building code of the city of Chicago. And then the entire process is, and everyone in the system told us that was the goal of the process, is not to punish the landlord. It's not to levy fines, even though fines can be levied. The goal is to get the building into compliance with the building code, to get the landlord to fix the building, the property owner to fix the property, and to get it out of court and get everyone back on their way and not take more housing offline in a city where there's already a huge problem with access to housing and affordable housing. So as a result, cases that end up in housing court end up dragging on for years. There's lots and lots of continuances. Landlords kind of get a almost endless runway to fix issues, and if they don't have the money or have other barriers to dealing with the code violation, they can come to court and ask for more time, and usually they get it. And it's very rare, we found, that judges, levy fines or really demand things be done faster, or appoint receivers, which they are also able to do, which are third-party companies that can be brought in to run the property if it's decided that the landlord is not, the property owner is not capable of doing it themselves. So that, and the tenants, even though they're in Illinois, there's case law that kind of establishes that tenants do actually have a formal, they have the right to intervene in these proceedings against their landlords and have a say in that housing court process, in that city lawsuit. We found that judges some judges just didn't think that they had that right, and they just, despite the existing law to the contrary, they would not allow tenants to intervene or never hold a hearing on tenants' ability to intervene in these cases. Basically banking on the fact that it's not going to be appealed, because in Cook County, these evictions, these proceedings are not on the record. There's no court reporters here. There's no recording equipment in these courtrooms. So people don't appeal. Meanwhile, in eviction court, where there is, things have gotten slightly better in the last few years in terms of now there's recording equipment. It's possible to get a record of what happened in court. Still, we found that cases move pretty quickly. Judges are mostly just interested, did you pay or not? And when tenants start saying, well, I withhold some of my rent, or I stopped paying because these rats are all over the building and my ceiling is falling down, and here I brought some photos, the eviction court judges aren't really interested in hearing about that. They don't ask about that as a matter of practice. And oftentimes they kind of just shut tenants down when they start talking about that stuff. And we heard time and time again, the eviction court judges saying, look, if this place is so bad, why don't you just leave? Why don't you just go and agree to a settlement with your landlord? And we don't, you can just why would you want to stay in this situation? So there was really no space for the kind of argument that Megan Franklin was making, which is that I just want this place to not be infested with rats. I want this to be a safe place for me and my kids to live, and I don't want to leave my community. So those are the dual kind of systems we discovered in these courtrooms that are just a few floors apart in the same building.
I just want to remind folks, feel free to populate the Q&A with questions. I'll keep on asking mine, but would love to hear your questions. What you're describing and what I mentioned in the intros that these buildings weren't necessarily seen as valuable as tear downs. And so what made them valuable, even in their dilapidated condition? And maybe you can tell us about one of the landlords, because again, who would want to keep a kind of crappy, dilapidated building? But these landlords did, I guess.
So we have, and over time, the number of investors in this idea, right? That we have mom and pop landlords, it's it's a foregone idea. It's just not, we're not seeing, we have some still, of course, but not to the level that we used to have them before. And essentially like we went into this like reporting. One of our reporting questions was like, what is the definition of a mom and pop landlord? Because technically, you know, if you're thinking about just one person owning a couple of buildings, there was one property owner who owned more almost 100 buildings in the city, and he was considered as a mom and pop landlord, even though at that point, you know, it's like it's a mini empire of properties. But what we found was that the money in some of these cases comes in the it's a real estate investment, so it comes in the buying and selling of property, not necessarily in the maintaining of the property. Some of these investors are not here to try to hold on to this property from years to come, and so what they end up doing is trying to squeeze as much money as they can from the rental income that comes from the properties, and then after a couple of years, and then just like flip it and sell it again. And there are incentives out in the market to buy and sell property, right? This is what fuels that this kind of market. And you know, every investor is sort of different. I mean, we had the range from like I mentioned before, like an owner that had, you know, almost 100 buildings in the city of Chicago. It's just one person. It was a small operation. He was definitely like a small business owner, if you will. Then we had, you know, a bit of a level up. It was the two brothers who own several buildings in Chicago, who were mostly in Black communities in the south side of the city. And they were significant issues with multiple of the buildings. In fact, the city of Chicago ended up taking them to housing court because of the conditions in multiple of these buildings. And what we know is that in many of these buildings, they were essentially cutting apartments for, if they were like a 2-bedroom apartment, maybe they'll convert it into like 2 1-bedroom apartments. So that is usually what investors do to try to increase the amount of rent. They were local, so as far as we know, they weren't trying to acquire a portfolio to sell it. They were just trying to acquire a portfolio of buildings. And then there were the outside investors who are coming to Chicago because real estate is getting so expensive in the coast, right? They come to Chicago where, you know, these kinds of buildings are still affordable, if you will, and they try to make a profit from them. And we're still seeing an increase in the number of those outside investors who are coming into the city. The one investment company that we found ended up being the owners of that company ended up being accused by the federal government of committing fraud over buildings that they had elsewhere in the nation. In fact, there were lawsuits about building conditions in Ohio, lawsuits about building conditions in Indiana. They were actually prohibited from owning buildings in Indiana. And here they were in Chicago owning a building that had serious code violations. It was a high-rise building that where residents were facing really horrible conditions, but even the trash wasn't even being picked up.
Wow. Did you?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
If I just to add that, like the value is the captive market of lower income renters who don't have a lot of options in a place like Chicago. It's very hard to find affordable rental apartments, especially if you don't have a subsidy. And there's like 600,000 renters in the city of Chicago, and 43,000 households have a rental assistance voucher, like a Section 8 voucher from the Chicago Housing Authority. So a very small percentage of the overall pool of renters. So tons and tons of people have no assistance of any kind with rent, and they're just looking for a place they can sort of afford. Lots of these neighborhoods in the city of Chicago have historic disinvestment. There's not a ton of available places to rent. And the people that own these buildings, they know that. They know they have a captive market. They have a population of folks who have a lot of challenges to just going anywhere because they're low income, and frequently folks have bad credit scores. They may have several children, so they need a larger place. It's hard to find that kind of apartment in places around town that have more new construction. So all of these market forces kind of combine where in the worst case scenarios, like Alejandra said, like landlords can essentially just milk the building. Like they know they don't have to invest much, and they'll still have rents coming in, you know, and in some cases, ultimately the building will get so bad that it'll be condemned by the city, and people will be forced to leave, then you've got a building that's just now, whatever, 60 apartments are now offline, but they got some money in the meantime without having to invest anything.
That's the trap in your title of your project, and something that the judges didn't seem to understand when he asked, "Why don't you just move?" Like, not so easy. I wonder if there were editorial or legal considerations that came up, with naming these landlords or these investments and linking them to eviction actions. Like, were you worried at all about them coming after you for exposing them? Was that an issue at all?
I mean, we rely pretty heavily on court records, everything on all public databases. So I mean, we did extensive work to try to find. I guess I'll take a step back and say, like, okay, so who is a landlord? It's definitely a good question, right? Like, because oftentimes the entity that owns a building, it's a limited liability corporation, and so then the reporting goes into like, okay, who owns the limited liability? What is the human, right? These are businesses, but there's usually still today in this day and age a human behind that corporation, right? Like. And so the question was like, who is the human behind the corporation? And so we did significant work in trying to essentially go through every limited liability corporation and get to the person who ultimately filed the records that said, yes, this is my corporation. And then we did a lot of work with property records to kind of tie the limited corporations to the properties themselves. And then we call them all and ask them what they had to say. I mean, we called them multiple times. We gave them multiple opportunities to comment. I mean, I thought we were very thorough. In the case of the company that ended up facing, being accused of corruption by the federal government, we were leaning on documents from the HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, the federal agency, and we were also relying on the federal investigation that uncovered that. And so, I mean, we still had legal review. I mean, all of our investigations were through legal review, but I think because we were so thorough in how we tied every property owner to these legal actions, that I think that helped tremendously.
So you said that you reached out to the property owners. I'm curious, did they respond? Did the city respond to your findings before publication? And how did you handle that?
No, that was actually like a very disappointing part of this, is because we had really wanted to sit down and talk to the heads of all of the city departments that are tasked with enforcing the building code. Because what we saw in court, we saw these city lawyers and these building department inspectors really trying their best to hold some of these property owners, recalcitrant property owners, accountable. I mean, in some situations, the property owner is really just somebody who's trying their best, who's financially unable to do the right thing. But most of the cases that we were really following closely, these were entities who were well capitalized. These were landlords who'd gotten very long runways to fix things, and they weren't doing it. And the city officials really were trying to hold them to account, and they were just running up against this brick wall of judges who were not going along with what the city was asking for. And so we had been hopeful that the city officials would be willing to be candid with us about, because we wanted to know, like, what makes your job hard? Like, what kind of reforms might be needed for you to be able to be more effective in the work that you're trying to do, that we see your staff in court trying so hard to do. And ultimately, neither the mayor's office nor any of the heads of these departments made themselves available to speak to us about this. And it felt, this wasn't a story that really put the blame at the feet of these city officials. So maybe the calculation was like, well, there's no need to go on the record about anything when we're not really being blamed for anything. But we sort of felt like it was a rare opportunity for them to come out looking like they're trying their best to do the right thing here, and generate some pressure to maybe get some kind of reforms on the judicial end of things. But it's Chicago, so there things are political, and maybe nobody thought it was worth the political risk to come out and criticize these judges. The chief judge did respond to us and kind of introduce this small reform that is it's significant. It felt like some kind of progress on this issue, though it's unclear if it's at this point if it's really changed anything. But essentially now, thanks to our reporting, like the chief judge basically created this new order that says that like anyone who's facing eviction is entitled to get information about whether their landlord is being sued by the city for building code violations. They and the clerk has to provide that information within 5 days or even 48 hours if there's like already a pending eviction order. So it opens up a little bit more of an information pipeline that it's absurd that it hadn't existed before. But this court bureaucracy is massive, and so it feels like a small step in the right direction.
Yeah, I was going to say your series explores sort of the history of failed reforms and proposals under consideration to help, elevate the tenants' rights in this equation. I'm glad to hear that, some practices are changing. Can you talk a little bit about how also you've been interacting with the tenants in the aftermath, in terms of your reporting?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been kind of a spectrum of responses. I mean, we had one of our tenants, Megan, who I mean, we were speaking right up until publication date, but she actually had to move out, and that was very difficult for her. And she asked essentially that after the story published, she just wanted nothing to do with, not because of anything that we had done. It was just she needed a break, and we respected that, of course. We did. She kept saying up until the very end that this was important to her, and like she understood that it wasn't going to help her, but she wanted other people to be helped by her story. And then there have been a couple of tenants that we have been following because there were cases still pending, right? So we wanted to know what happens when tenants take their landlords to court. So there's housing court, there's eviction court, but separately, you can sue your landlord for retaliation. And we got into that a little bit in the story, but the cases that we were following had not been completed by the time the story published. And so we still are following those stories, and we actually hope to publish something later this year that kind of goes into what happens when you actually sue your landlord for retaliation.
Yeah. What do you wish that you knew when you started this reporting? What do you wish, what do you know now that you wish you knew when you started it, in terms of like, it took us 6 months to figure that out. So we all go through that in our evolution on a story, but I wonder what you guys would pass on to someone saying like, here's what I learned the hard way. Anyhow, it could be the data, it could be sources. I don't know. What
Yeah.
there's something for you?
I don't think that as far as the kind of reporting aspect of things, that there would have been any kind of shortcuts or efficiencies, because we were both, like, I had reported about eviction court for years, but I didn't know anything about the housing court process. A lot of this, the court aspect of things was really new to us, and it just took time of court watching and talking to people and building sources with attorneys before we could understand what is going on and what we're seeing in court and what things mean. So that part of it was not, I don't think there was anything that we could have done differently. And you just kind of have to start showing up into a space until you can understand the language. But I guess, yeah, if I was going to do it again, and my advice to anybody is that start that, unless you are yourself a very high level data journalist, start that collaboration with someone who's really good with data analysis and programming languages early, because yeah, I think as far as our kind of we could have, would have, should have, I feel like all of our thoughts in that space were around how if we had started working with DataMate earlier, we could have found out XYZ sooner. But
yeah,
I mean, for context, it also, I mean, this investigation took more than a year, but also like I was fresh from having a baby and was part-time and partially still on maternity leave for like half of that time. So I still feel like we did at a pretty good pace given those limitations as well.
Yeah. Here's a question from an attendee. What was the biggest way you grew as a reporter, or the biggest lesson for how you'd approach future investigations? It's a little bit different side of the question.
Wow. I mean, I think every investigation helps you grow as a reporter. I was a fresh hire, and I had never really fully covered the Cook County court system. I mean, I had covered cases in my career, and I had requested records, and I had limited observations of criminal court. But like Maya said, like housing court was a completely different beast for me, and eviction court was something that I had never reported. I mean, I read the books about it. And I think that I can see as I think about it, like a lot of growth in like how I understand the court system, like what kind of questions to ask, like how to, yeah, I mean, like it was so interesting showing up to court the very few times. I mean, so few people, it's such an interesting that like so few people go and observe housing court that literally the judges will stop proceedings and ask, who are you? What are you doing? And you would be like, I'm just observing here, Your Honor. And they would be like, well, what are you observing? And I would be like, I'm observing the court. What happens today? And then they were like, what exactly about today? And it was like this like really weird exchange where I was like, I'm just here trying to do my job. and they had a lot of questions about it too. And we were always very honest at whichever step we were in our investigation. In the beginning, it was literally like, I don't know anything about this. And so I'm just here trying to understand how it works. Yeah, and I forgot the second part of the question.
No, that's okay. I
I
remember.
could add to that too. In terms of like the other thing, which might be useful for other people contemplating doing these kinds of projects in partnership with another reporters, like I think we learned a lot about also just like collaborating together on a story. Both of us had done projects with other reporters before, but for me it had been a few years, and I'd never done a project where we really were like co-writing like a 5-part, like a 5-article package essentially. So, but even before the writing part, I mean, working with another reporter, like people think about the reporter-editor relationship, but this was like a 3-way relationship here. We had to understand how the other person works, how our mind works, how we think about things, and that I would say that for me that was a huge learning curve and like a growth process of just like how to like inhabit a story with another person's mind. So my advice would be to just have like a lot of conversations early on about like how do you work, how do you prefer to communicate, how do you keep notes, like what is your standard? How do you date documents? You know what I mean? Like little things like that come up as you're working with like another human being's brain, that can really impact the work because of just like small organizational differences between you and your reporting partners. So
Yeah. Yeah. And you anticipated a question, which was an example of a way you think you worked well as a team. I often say that collaborations really happen at the reporter level. Like organizations can collaborate, but in the end, how do the reporters actually work together? And your examples are really good. And Alejandra, I think it was you who your story about being the only reporter in court, like the idea of just showing up sometimes. I was really struck by that it's this territory that nobody actually shows up in. You can do a lot of reporting around it, but just the difference of being present and being able to, sometimes, as you said, like decisions happen really fast, and, you might even miss it. But if you're in court, you're like present, you're eyewitness. And I guess, you get the attention, and maybe your presence also, makes the court realize someone's watching them, which I think, I don't know if you felt that way, but it would seem to me that would be kind of another advantage, which is, hey, this isn't happening in the shadows. This isn't happening, you know, in some basement. I am here and I'm taking stock of like what you're saying to the tenants and how you're treating the tenants, et cetera.
I mean, one
Um,
of the things that really like spoke to me about the importance of the work that we did came, and it's something that we didn't, you know, how did you say this in the story, right? You can't really go into that level, but like we were speaking with sources who told us essentially like, thank God you're watching and please come back again, and like how they felt that there was like a clear difference in the days that, because we didn't watch every single day, but that there was a clear difference in the days that we were court watching and we will show up, and in the days that we did not show up for court. And to me that was important. I mean, it was significant. I will say that like that our journalistic, it speaks to the power of the press and the reason why we continue to be important to this democracy, right? Like being there and observing is important.
Well, I really appreciate that. Any last questions? Well, so much of this great advice is on a tip sheet that Maya and Alejandra have put together. We will post that on the FIJ site. As I said, everyone who registered, you're going to be getting an email from FIJ sometime in the next week with a link to the recording and the webinar and the tip sheet. A couple of reminders. We are about to, in terms of the grant cycle, we review proposals 3 to 4 times a year for grants of up to $10,000, and the next deadline is May 5th, so you still have plenty of time. We also do something now called seed funding, and I think many of you have probably experienced that you have to do a little bit of reporting before you know enough to know whether or not there's a story there. And so we also provide grants of up to $2,500 for this preliminary reporting that often leads to full investigations. So if you get a seed grant, you can then apply for a full grant. Again, these grants can cover things like open records requests or initial reporting trips. The deadline for those grants is Friday, May 9th. So Monday, May 5th for the regular grants, May 9th for the seed grants. We also accept proposals for follow-up coverage to original investigations that were funded in part from FIJ. So for people who may have gotten grants, you guys, if you want to do more follow-up, we'd welcome your proposals. If you have questions about applying or you want to make a suggestion for a webinar, you can email us at grants@fij.org. If you go to the FIJ site under resources, there's an FAQ, there's a video. We want to help you with the application process. We really want people to apply. We want to give the money away. That is what we're here for, and we want to make as many investigations as there are out there possible. So with all of that, I want to thank you too. This was really wonderful. Congratulations again on your IRE award. Thanks to everyone who attended, and have a great weekend. Take care.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.